let's take a look at the objectives first. As you can see, my office is LAH. That should be 233E, not 223E, so there's a number of mistakes on this. On almost everything that I give you, there'll be mistakes. Go up in the elevator, go right out of the elevator, go down the hall in the east wing. First door on the right is the literature area. There's a, you notice how much this place looks like a hospital? Well, this looks like a nurse's station. The secretary sits there. So go around the nurse's station, and then the offices are a little like the offices the doctor puts you in to pretend he's looking at you, but you're not going to see him again for another 30 minutes. That's what the offices look like. So ours is all the way around on the right, and when you come to we can't go any further, it's to the right of that. It's a big office with no windows in it. It's actually a storage room, but Professor Callender and I share that office, and so we gave up the window to have more room. That's my phone number here at the college. If you leave me a telephone message, make sure you leave your own number so that I can get back to you. Probably the quickest way to get in touch with me, if it's between Thursday and Tuesday, is by email. And as you can see, that's my email address there, wwatkins@brookdale.cc.nj.us. When you send me an email, incredible tricky man. When you send me an email, I don't usually read my email till 4 or 5 in the morning. So what that means, if you send me a message at 10 this morning, I'm not going to read it until 3 or 4 tomorrow morning, but I will get right back to you. So I figure there'll be about a day delay on that. There might be 2 or 3 days delay if you leave me a phone message on Thursday, because I won't get it until between classes, probably on Tuesday. Especially this first week when everything is so hectic. So anybody have any questions about how to get in touch with me? Mrs. Albano's name is there because she's the literature secretary. She's sort of like Wendy and the Lost Boys. She keeps track of everything we're doing. So quite often she'll be able to answer your questions. Or if you're missing a handout, if you stop in there, she can usually find it. The required text for the course, on the good side, we used to have Fiction 100, which was a $40 book, but they kept changing the stories, so now I just Xeroxed them and hand them out. So you got somewhat of a savings there. Greek drama by Haddis. The only play that we're reading out of that is Oedipus Rex or Oedipus the King. So if you've stolen your old high school anthology, it's probably in there. If you have any drama anthology, it's in that. Finding it in the library and Xeroxing it wouldn't save you that much money anyway. But it's probably in any drama anthology in the library as well. So you probably want to pick out the Greek drama book by Haddis. The other two are novels, The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway and Slaughterhouse-Five by Vonnegut. Now, I hadn't gotten Vonnegut for 5 years, but this year we're definitely going to get to it because I've taken about the first 6 weeks out of the course and changed it around. So we should be using all 3 of those books, so they would be worth buying. They're not super expensive, but they're about the only way you can get those readings. Almost all the other readings will be handouts. So pretty much the week before we do, say, classical, medieval, I'll be giving you a handout on that. Which reminds me that the reading for next week will be Plato's Allegory of the Cave and the quotes from Deepak Chopra and from Zeno. It's on the other side of the makeup topics. There'll be a quiz on those readings. The sample test that you have. I give you that for a couple reasons. One is, now the sample test, the quiz that we have will be taken directly from the sample test. So 10 of these 23 questions will appear on the sample test. what I would do if I were you is before I did the reading, I would read over the sample test, see what the questions are. But one of the purposes of giving this sample test is that it directs your reading. And the second reason is you really probably can't pass the quizzes without doing the reading. So it encourages people to do the reading. After 30-odd years, it finally dawned on me that if you don't give quizzes, a lot of people don't actually do the reading. And if you don't do the reading, it's going to be very hard to follow what's going on. A lot of this stuff is old. I mean, 2,000 years old, some of it. So language has changed. The expectations of the audience has changed. Don't underestimate the reading. It doesn't look like it's very much, and it really isn't compared to, say, the reading in world literature. But there's still a reasonable amount. When you're reading it, if it seems difficult, and some of it will, when, for example, we get to the metaphysicals, they believed that if you wrote a poem and people could understand it the first time they read it, it wasn't much of a poem. They were looking for the infinite poem that had a different meaning every time. Even if the reading is difficult, don't bail out on it partway through. Go all the way through it, because when we start going over it, if it hasn't made sense before, it will make sense after we go over it in class. But it probably won't make sense if you haven't at least looked at it one time, gone through it at least once. And you'll need to go through the readings, of course, to pass the sample test. Any questions on the readings of the sample test? Okay, the course objectives is that you're able to apply the characteristics of the major literary movements, and the literary movements are not just categories that English teachers made up so that they seem to know things that nobody else knew. As you'll see when we do the different types of criticism next week, they're decisions that groups of writers at various times in history have made about what writing ought to be. So we'll be looking at those. You need to be able to apply them to a variety of works from different historical periods. And we'll also be looking at the 4 types of text-based criticism. That is to say, biographical, historical, literary movements, and aesthetic. Text-based means that it focuses on the work, on the poem, on the story. It doesn't use that to get at something else. But we'll be looking at that in depth next week. Overall, my purpose in the course is that after you've taken it, that you would do at least a grade better, assuming you wouldn't have gotten an A already, in any other literature course that you take. And hopefully that your grades will improve in all of the courses that you take. For that reason, one of the things that I'll be looking at, if you look there, is what the course itself should do, is to introduce a technique for using imagination and association to help memorize information. As you'll see, there are 2 sides of the brain, one of which uses words, the other which uses icons, multi-sensory images, almost little chunks of reality to think of things. What that means is that the right side of the brain's got a lot more storage capacity than the left side has, the word-using side. We tend to store information in that word-using side, and it's not really the best place to do it. So I'm going to show you some techniques for memorization that ought to help you not only in here, but in any other course that you take. We'll also be looking at techniques for taking tests, for ways to study, ways to get rid of test anxiety. How many of you usually don't do as well as you thought you would do in a given course? In other words, you feel like you really know the material worth an A, but you end up with a B, or you end up with a C, or you end up doing terrible when you really thought you understood the course. That's test anxiety more than likely. There's a reciprocal relationship that I'll keep going back to throughout the course. There's actually 2 of them. Let me start with the first one. The relationship between sensation and emotion. Sensation goes up. What happens to emotion? Does it go up or down? Sensation, you tickle people. Emotion, they laugh. You tickle them more, what happens?
It goes up.
It goes up. They laugh more. Sensation goes up, emotion goes up. Emotion goes up, what happens to the intellect? Does it go up or down? Not generally when the emotions go up, generally the intellect goes down. For example, if I brought a pit bull in here and let it loose in the room, very few of you would be sitting there saying, do you know that the jaw pressure on that creature is 2,000 pounds per square inch, and that its jaw has a locking arrangement, something like a vice grip? Most of us will be up on the table, and we'll be lucky if we can say, dog. Because as the intellect goes up, the emotions go down. Or at the height of passion, do you stop and say to yourself, this is certainly a pleasurable experience, which I hope we'll be able to duplicate on some future occasion? Not usually. The greater the sensation, the more the emotion, the more the emotion, the more the intellect goes down. Neighbors are banging on the door, somebody being killed in there. No, our emotions went way up. We lost our vocabulary for a while. But it's okay now. We've finally gotten it back again. Emotions go up, generally the intellect goes down. When you watch a horror movie, the person always looks at the bloody handprint on the door to the cellar, and where do they go?
Down the cellar.
Down into the dark cellar. Why? I mean, when you look at that, okay, because there's no movie if they don't. But beside that, why would that make sense in real life? Because emotions go up. You see a bloody handprint on your door, that tends to upset you a little. I hope it does anyway. You can't think, and so you do the dumbest thing possible. You go downstairs where the serial killer is waiting. So when the emotions go up, the intellect goes down. Conversely, the intellect goes up, what happens to the emotions?
Goes down.
They go down. The more you think, the less you feel. It's one of the choices that, actually it's one of the choices anybody has to make. Are you going to pay complete attention to the sensations of what goes on, or are you going to try to make sense of it? To the extent that you do one or the other, you have to sacrifice its opposite. If you're figuring out what's going on, you can't be paying as much attention to what's going on. You can't get as much of the sensation. Somebody is nibbling on your ear, and you are thinking about, why are they doing this? Are they manipulating me in some way? Do they have a hidden agenda that's not going on? How much of that sensation are you getting? 100%? No, probably an awful lot less than that. After a while, you don't even feel anything. So your intellect goes up, your emotions go down. When you go to take a test, if you have test anxiety, your emotions go up. So what happens to your ability to think? It goes down. It's the bloody handprint on the door. As soon as you walk into that testing center, you're in the middle of a horror movie. And so it gets hard to think. And we'll be looking at a couple ways to avoid test anxiety. Some people have, a lot of people have. How many of you really look forward to taking tests? One. Yeah. I always looked at it that way. I didn't mind. Tests to me were just a chance to show off, so I always liked tests. But generally, people see them as a measure of who they are as a person, and that makes them upset. And so most people have at least a little bit of test anxiety. And we're going to look at some ways to avoid that. Third, we're going to be looking at understanding literature from what's basically a traditional approach. And what we'll be doing is called literary criticism. But criticism doesn't mean finding something bad about a thing. What literary criticism is an attempt to understand the work on a multiplicity of levels. Even the simplest work means more than one thing. Is there a single absolute meaning to a work of literature? One interpretation. Do you have no opinion on this at all? How many people think there is one single interpretation? How many people think there's a lot of interpretations? Okay, how come?
No way.
Mental toss of the coin? You must have something to base your opinion on. Why do you think there's more than one interpretation?
I just think because you could look at anything like in the world, like everyone has a different opinion about, so especially like literature. like what I may read and have an opinion about, like she may have a different one or whatever.
Each person's got different experiences that they bring to the interpretation. When it comes down to literature, it's not like writing directions for something. It's not that simple. It works on a lot of different levels. So when people come to it, they interact with it. There's a whole bunch of criticism based on the audience, not on the text. When we get to it, I'll mention deconstructionism, which says basically there's no meaning at all, except what the reader brings to it. Different people will have different experiences. They're going to interpret the story in different ways. How about the author? What about his meaning? Did he have, is there a single meaning that the author had? Are any of you writers? You ever have the experience where you get one of those manuscripts that just flows out and you look at it, it just comes and you put it aside, you pick it up the next day and you go, wow, who's put this here? You don't even remember writing it some of the time. Generally, those are the manuscripts that are almost perfect first draft. You don't have to make very many corrections of them at all. That's not an uncommon experience. Almost anybody who writes very much at all will tell you that they've had that point where it's almost like you're possessed. In fact, when we look at the Greeks, as we will when we look at the classical period, when they talked about inspiration, breathing into the Spirit, they meant what we would call possession. Almost any Greek or Roman who sat down to write, the very first thing they did was invoke the Muses, was ask one of the goddesses in charge of the different kinds of poetry, in charge of drama, to come down, get inside their body, and help them write it within the absolute extremes of their talent. And when they did, that's one of the reasons why when we look at the Greeks, they didn't hold authors individually in such enormously high esteem because they really didn't do the writing anyway. They had a lot of help from the Muses. But their idea of inspiration was like possession. Well, if the best stuff that a writer produces is often produced in a state of what seems to be almost possession, when he's not consciously there, then his conscious intent isn't the only thing that goes in the manuscript. There's a whole lot of stuff in the manuscript that the author doesn't even know he put there. Now it's like Robert Frost said, poetry is like mineral rights. You're entitled to whatever the reader finds there. Some writers, however, don't like to have their works discussed, especially when they're around. Everybody's got secrets. Everybody. I'm sure even by now you've got some things that you wouldn't tell people in general. Well, that may have changed, although now apparently if you could get on Jerry Springer, maybe you would tell us all your terrible secrets. But most people like to keep them to themselves. And sometimes the author is listening to his work discussed and somebody starts to get at a meaning, something he's put in there, and he's sitting and saying, oh my God, I told him that. I don't even admit that to myself. So they don't like what's going on. The author isn't always aware of what he put into the manuscript. And since literature in particular uses a lot of symbolism, a lot of things that really stand for something else, the author isn't entirely aware of what he did there. So the idea that no matter how long you've been in the business of deciphering literature, that you'll come up with the single possible interpretation for that work is highly unlikely. Have you ever had an instructor who was sure that they had the way this thing was supposed to be understood? No? All of your instructors said, well, this is what I think, but it's not the only thing. You've had some that said, this is what it means. What do you do when you get there?
We dropped her course.
Good thing. That was a good thing to do. If you have any possibility. What if you can't get out of the course?
Fight them.
When we get to the Romantics, you're going to love the Romantics. And you're also going to like the medieval. When you're confronted with evil, you have to confront with it. You can never take a backward step from evil. If you want to live with yourself, that might be what you need to do. Now, you have to be able to match wits with them. The problem with that is, it's like playing tennis against somebody and they get to call all the shots on the line, whether they're in or out. Who's going to be the ultimate determiner of whether your instructor is right or not? He is. So the smart thing is to write down what they said, and when the test comes, give it back to them. Now, that may be damaging to your self-image. So sometimes, if you can battle intellectually with whoever it is, then maybe you should do that. On the other hand, when we're going to be looking at it, nothing is certain. I mean, when we get to reality next week, you'll see even reality is questionable. Nothing is certain. So the decisions you make, what I'll usually do is give you alternatives for you to decide between. And you may come up with other alternatives as well. When it comes to the interpretation, I'll often tell you what I think it means. But that doesn't mean that that is what it means. I may be totally off. Don't forget, everybody looks at the world in terms of their experiences. So my view is no less biased than your view is. One of the things, though, on your interpretation, when you have an interpretation, I'll probably ask you two things. One, why do you think so? And the best way to explain, and often, especially to defend your interpretation, is to go to the work itself. So in other words, I give you a poem, and you say, well, I think this poem is about sadness. What's the first question I'm going to ask you? Why do you think so? Now, I mean, it might just be you're depressed that day, so pretty much everything I give you is going to look like it's sad. If that's not the case, you ought to be able to look at the work and we'll go say, well, look here. It says grief in line 6 and talks about sorrow in line 11. And the picture that he paints initially is these gray clouds that are moving in and blotting out the sun, and the flowers are all curling up in the poem. Dark colors are mentioned. There's one person in it, but they're all alone in a desolate landscape. In other words, you go to the work. So that's basically what I expect you to be able to do, is to look at the work, form an interpretation, and then to be able to explain and defend your interpretation. And the best place to go when you're doing either of those things is to the work itself. This is what's in the book, this is what's in the poem, this is what's in the story, this is what's in the novel. It makes me think this is what it means. There are 9 units now in the course. The first one is called Approaches to Learning, and that's the one we're going to be doing most of today. And it will be basically about how to take tests and how to study, and using that memory technique and how to avoid test anxiety. The second one is Approaches to Literature, and that's going to be about the 4 kinds of criticism. And we'll probably spend at least a week or more on that. Then we'll be looking at the various literary movements. Now, these correspond to historical periods. But that's mainly because everything seems to occur in time. So everything's got a time. What they really represent, again, is the choices that an author will make. And that will be one of the ways that we'll look at the work, is what does the author intend to do? Anybody have any questions on the first side of that sheet? The second side of the sheet, where it talks about competencies there. Brookdale has a master plan. I think world domination is the ultimate goal of it. But I've been here since, I'm one of the originals. I was here before the buildings. There were about 30 people who met over in a Nike base out in Middletown and put together a curriculum and put together a whole lot of the first courses for the course, and I'm one of those. I didn't realize at the time that that was such a significant thing. You rarely get the chance to found a college, to set it up. So I've seen a lot of administrations come and go. And this is not the dumbest administration that's ever been here by a long shot. However, I think they often have grandiose ideas, and a lot of what they want me to do is absolute nonsense. And since I'm not young and idealistic anymore, I don't fight them nearly as much as I used to. So the reason this is arranged in competencies is because the master plan requires that the objectives of the course be linked to the goals of the college. And one of the goals of the college is that people's reading ought to improve while they're here. So to test and improve your reading competency, we'll be reading several hundred pages of prose and poetry from different historical periods. Again, the readings aren't that many, but you do really want to keep up with them. And the readings, as I had mentioned earlier, are going to be evaluated by a quiz. We'll have one almost every week, or at least every time we change units. Critical thinking is another competency that people are supposed to develop out of a college education. And actually, what they're saying isn't as preposterous as I make it sound. I mean, why come to college? Why are most of you here?
Get a better job.
How many of you are here to get a better job? That's generally the reason. How many are here to find yourself? Well, things have changed. When Brookdale started out during the hippie revolution at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, if I had asked that question then, 90% of the students would have been here to find themselves. How they got lost, nobody ever knew, but it was the 60s, people were smoking a lot of dope. That could be how they got lost. But they were here to find out who they were. And as you see, one of the approaches to literature is that it's not just literature, but to college education, is that it's to take your interests and abilities and develop them to their fullest possible potential. Things have changed considerably. Most people are here because this is a ticket to the job world. They didn't necessarily want to learn a lot about literature. It's one of the general ed requirements. Why did they make those general ed requirements? Why do you have to take something in the sciences and something in math and something in the humanities? A certain number of credits. I think it's 9 in each or something. Why did they make that a prerequisite for a college education? If you're going to go on to be a business major, why do you need that stuff?
They want to make college better.
Well, it does. Sorry, say that again.
They want to make the college look better.
So it looks more like a real college? Well, that's part of it, although Brookdale didn't set those standards. They're set by the state. In fact, they're kind of national standards. No matter what school you go to, 4-year or 2-year, you still will have to take a certain number of general education things. In other words, the people who run higher education, the college presidents and the provosts and things, got together and said, what do we think a college education ought to be? And one of the things they thought was that it ought to make you a more rounded person. This is not without costs. The fact that you're here is going to have a significant impact, and maybe even more of an impact when you go on to 4-year schools than you might initially imagine. For example, how many of you have been to 4-year schools? When you went away and came back at Thanksgiving, and you met all those people you'd gone to high school with and thought you were going to be close with forever, what happened?
I was still pretty close.
You didn't feel estranged from them at all?
Not really.
That's surprising. How about you?
Yeah, I don't talk to anyone. I don't talk to any of them.
You don't see that. What generally happens is you come back and you think these are going to be your friends forever, and you say, hey, how you doing? And they say, yeah, how are you? And then there's this big dull silence. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons why they were your friends in high school is that you had a lot of shared experiences. You went to the same place every day for 7 hours. You had generally the same teachers. The social milieu that you moved in was generally the same. You shared experiences. You don't share those experiences. But that's not the only thing that separates you from your friends when you go away to school. Your life is different than theirs. How? What made for that gap?
they all basically moved on, went to different schools. Some went out of state, so rarely see them.
You can't, just the fact that you don't see them all very much.
Or different
Did you
jobs.
notice the difference between the friends who didn't go on to college and the ones that did?
Well, I still see them because they're around now, because I'm back home. But when I was away, I really didn't get to see any of them. I moved on, made new friends.
Yeah. Life changes. You think things are going to stay the same, but they really aren't. Actually, you've already changed from the person that you were when you got out of high school anyway. Because you have decided to come to college. How many of you work? That's comically, when, right after the dinosaurs died and I went to college, almost everybody who went to college, that was what they did. That was all that they did. Maybe they had a part-time job, they worked maybe 10 hours, but most didn't. Most college students went to college. That was their job. Now, the average student works at least 20, and a great many work 40 or more hours a week, beside going to school. You've taken on an adventure. Now, adventures are difficult. They're filled with a lot of setbacks and a lot of difficulties. That's what makes them adventures. It's also what makes them interesting. The fact that you've taken on this task makes you different than the people who haven't. You're going to have to learn to organize your time a lot better than they do. You're going to have to be a lot more serious than they are. The time when students went off to college and partied 80% of the time, I mean, unless you've got a father who's been president and owns an oil company, you're probably not going to be able to do that. So that's going to alienate you to some extent from the people that you knew. Just the fact that your life's taken a different direction. How many of you are geniuses? Really? I don't think that's right. I think you've probably underestimated yourselves. What do people normally think of when they think of a genius?
Extremely high IQ.
IQ is the whole thing. What does IQ measure?
Potential to learn.
Supposedly your potential to learn. But in fact, only your potential to succeed in an academic situation for the most part. In other words, IQ does not measure your social ability. It doesn't measure your emotional abilities. Some people form friendships and relationships much more easily than other people. Some people are just likable people. That's a gift. That's an emotional IQ. That's a social IQ. But when you take an IQ test, it doesn't measure that. It measures, if anything, and there are a lot of doubts whether it measures anything, it measures your intellect. If you weren't a genius, the odds are that you are in one way or another. For example, IQ has no measure at all of creativity. And yet all of the advances that humanity has made has come as a result of somebody thinking in a new way. IQ doesn't measure that. Oh, I've fallen into one of those potholes. What was right before the social IQ? Oh, I remember now. How many of you would be an intellectual genius if you had the chance? Would. Generally, there is almost no correlation between high IQ and a successful life. Being bright doesn't make you more money, for the most part. Most of the people who have a high IQ are isolated from other people. Their marriages fall apart at a higher rate. Their relationships either don't get established or fall apart more quickly. They have generally more emotional and psychological difficulties than other people. And they're not necessarily more materially successful. Everybody plays genius up as if it's a wonderful thing to be, when in fact, high IQ really just isolates you. And it doesn't have that many advantages. If you had a high social IQ, you would be far more successful than somebody with a high intellectual IQ. If you can take 15 people and get them to work together cooperatively and produce something of value out of that, your marketability is enormously higher than if you seem to be brilliant. One of the focuses of college is on the intellect. It's on developing your intellect. The longer I'm in it, the more I wonder whether that's necessarily a good thing. In other words, one of the things that literature is useful for. Well, let me ask you, what is literature useful for? Is it useful at all? I mean, I know you got to take it. General Ed, 3 credits, seemed easier than art. You can't draw. Why teach literature anyway? Why read literature? One of the things that college education may certify is that people will show up on time, not be absent very often, and do whatever you tell them, no matter how stupid they think it is. This might be the case. They told you to take a literature course. They said, okay, that's what I have to do. It actually will have some value, some practical value. One of the things about literature is it's got people in it. Generally, the people face some kind of problems. Usually, if the work of literature lasts, those problems are universal problems. They're problems that most people at different periods in time are going to run into. So why do we want to look at how somebody handled a problem that you might meet and solved it? What's the advantage of that? When you come to that problem, you know at least one way of solving it. You can avoid a lot of the headaches and heartaches of life by having vicariously had experiences through literature. What about people? Almost every literary work's got a character in it somewhere. It's got a person in it somewhere. Well, why do you want to know about people? How many of you are going to be hermits in later on in life? You're going to be dealing with people. The better you understand them, the more easy it's going to be to work with them. And if you want to look at it from a purely egotistical point of view, the easier it is to get your own way, the better you understand people. That doesn't necessarily say that you're manipulating them to their detriment. Often the easiest way to succeed is to find out what other people want, see how it corresponds to what you want, and see some way that you can be mutually advantageous to one another in achieving those goals. In other words, everybody asks, what's in it for me? If you want to be ahead of the game, you got to ask, what's in it for you? When I figure out what's in it for you, I know what I want to get out of it. I can figure out a way that we can both get what we want. Generally cooperative effort. So in other words, better you understand people, which you can get from literature, because it's going to show you a lot of different kind of people, but they'll be generalized. In other words, any literary character you pick up is probably going to have characteristics that you'll find out in the real world. Why is that so? Why will most characters in literature have at least some of the qualities that you can find in your daily life?
Have to have them relate to you.
So you can relate to them. If you had a character that didn't have characteristics like anybody else, no reader would have been able to identify with them, and the work would never have lasted. So what that means is that when you look at characters, you're going to see stuff that you'll see around you all the time. And one of the things that an author does is it shows you how people work. What makes them do what they do, especially when you look at a novel. 20 years ago, when the psychological novel was commonplace, now novels tend to be more action and adventure. But they used to be about thinking. When they were about thinking, the author frequently took characters and showed you in depth what was going on in their mind at every stage of their experiences that they were relating. If you know how one person works, you know how an awful lot of people work. So when you read literature, it gives you insight into other people. For a while, how many of you are taking business? For a while, a business degree was what businesses were looking for. Now, they tend to be looking for a degree in English and communications as much, if not more, than a degree in business. Why? Well, those of you who are business majors, what's happening to business? Is it the same as it always was?
No.
How's it changing?
Internet. The internet.
The internet's changed it enormously. Information and the ability to communicate with people is now more important than understanding the mechanics of things. Now, there are people who have to decide how to get the product into the store, out of the warehouse and into the stores, how to get it off the assembly line and into the warehouse. That's still a valuable part. But business now has to keep going up. It can't level off and it can't go backwards. The economy requires that we keep selling more stuff all the time. Well, the internet's allowed us to do that, which means that you've got to have really good communication skills now to be very successful in business. So that's one of the reasons why they're looking for people with English and with humanities degrees. It used to be if you had a humanities degree, there were a lot of gas station jobs that you could probably get because nobody had a lot of use for it. And then finally somebody figured out, wait a minute, if you studied the humanities, you studied people. If you know people, and you know how to sell people stuff, you know how to get people to work together, you know how to get them to work alone. In other words, motivating people gets to be part of what it is you know how to do. And the fact that you're going to pick up all of those skills is going to make you different than the people who didn't attempt to do that. You're actually the members of an elite. It's a big elite. Picks up maybe 30 or 40% of the population, goes on and has at least 1 year of college. But it's still an elite. It still gives you advantages over people who haven't done that. The idea of being a rounded person. Why did colleges want you to be rounded? The more interests and abilities you have, the more adaptable you are. One of the ways that your life is a lot different than my life was when I was young is that the number of opportunities is much greater. And the turnover in everything is so much more rapid now. In the 60s, in the early 60s, people looked for an employer that they expected to work for the whole of their lives. How many of you expect to work for the same company the whole of your working career? No, nobody does anymore. Of course, there's no benefits to it anymore either. There was a time when if you worked for a company for 20 years, when you got old, it took care of you. Now, as soon as you hit 40, and that's not that far, I mean, I know it sounds to many of you like, oh man, 40. I won't be 40 for a long, long, long time. It'll come on you like that. Well, when you get to be 40, there's somebody up there going, you know, we fired this guy, we can hire 2 people for the salary he's making now. And no, they won't be as good as him, but so what? We'll drop 15% in efficiency and we'll make up 40% in money, and the bottom line is we can make more money by getting somebody else. There's no reason to be loyal to a corporation anymore because there's nothing in it. And so people jump from job to job, and everybody's on the lookout to move somewhere else, and for good reason. It's probably what we should be doing. You can see it in sports. There was a time when if you rooted for a particular sports team, the players stayed the same from year to year. Not the case now. They move continually. Well, free agency has come to everybody's job now, not just athletics. Everybody's a free agent. So if you can get a better deal, you're naturally going to jump for it. Being able to do that, being adaptable is a large part of that. If you had to have one characteristic that was going to make you successful, it would probably be your ability to adapt. Because your world is going to turn over so much faster than it's ever turned over before in the entire history of mankind. The amount of knowledge available is now already far more than any one person can really get a handle on. Most people specialize relatively early in their intellectual careers because there's so much in any given field for you to learn about. If you put up aluminum siding, there's all kind of stuff you need to know now that you didn't used to know. There's so much more information available. So one of the main techniques that you have to learn is the ability to acquire information and the ability to manipulate it. The ability to learn is more important than anything that you'll learn. Just that process of learning, which is one of the reasons why we're going to spend this first part of the unit looking at ways to learn, ways to memorize things. To get back to the objectives for a second, critical thinking is part of that, broadening people as individuals. Informing your own interpretation, it requires you to think critically. It requires you to say, here are some concepts that I've learned, now how do they apply to things? And that's what I'll be looking for you to do. When you interpret a piece of literature, I'm going to give you some tools for doing that, different ways to do it. And I'll be looking for you to be able to apply them, and that's part of that critical thinking competency that we're supposed to be developing. Writing competency. Writing's making a comeback. For a while, you could get by orally. If you could talk, it didn't matter that you couldn't write very well. Why has writing become suddenly more important? You notice what I ask you for on these cards. Your email addresses. Why?
Content.
So I can get in touch with you. How many of you do look at your email every day? When you go to work for a corporation, and I don't know who else, well, you might be working for yourself, but if you go to work for any larger business, a whole lot of your job's going to be done by email. So what's that got to do with writing? You got to be able to write. You got to be able to put your ideas in some succinct form. You have to be able to get right to the core of what it is you want to say. Because when you send somebody an email, can you send them an 8-page email?
Yes.
You can do it physically, but if I get an 8-page email, I don't think I'm getting past page 2. And it's the same thing when you're in business. If you send somebody an email, you got to be able to get them. One of the things that the internet has done is it's changed the way information is disseminated to people. When you go on the web, when you go to a website, you notice the way information is grouped. Is it page after page of information? No. How is it arranged? Usually a paragraph or two at the most. And then you click on it and go to another paragraph. Now, there was a time you could take all those paragraphs in a website and put them all together in one document that you could read straight through. But that's not the way people access information anymore. They go to something, and if they want to know more about it, they click and go to another site. There are paragraphs in that overall document that you may never read if you go to a website. Some of them you'll never bother to access. That's made information different. The fact that you've got to be able to do something in 100 words is a lot different than doing it in 500 words or 1,000 words. So it means that your writing competencies, what you need to be able to do with writing. And when we look at, for example, how to score 100 points on a 100-point essay, it's going to be looking at how you do make your information as concise as you can make it. So we'll be doing some writing in here. In fact, the evaluation for the class consists of two in-class essay examinations. They'll have different kinds of questions. Short essay questions, which will be about 250 words long. You'll cite different characteristics from the literary movements that you'll be comparing. You need to give examples, and you should be able to quote. And then there'll be long essays, which are 750 words or more, and you'll need to do the same thing in there, except you'll need to do more quoting. And the reason that you quote is because you'll be quoting from the text, because that's the best authority you can go to when you're trying to defend your interpretation. You will know, when we look at that methods of evaluation, there are actually 4 components to your grade. The first one is the Jaws of Poetry, and I should tell you about that now. On that, directions for the Jaws of Poetry. You've actually been robbed, but you don't know it. If you had come here a year and a half ago, you would have had access to 30 computers and the Jaws of Poetry down at the end of this hall. They took all those computers and moved them over to the library, because that's one of the failings of Brookdale, is that it gets equipment, but it doesn't fund maintaining it for very long. And because we outsourced, it's not profitable, the company we outsourced to run those computers, so you don't have them anymore. So the Jaws of Poetry has been moved to the library. Go in the door, go to the main desk, and off to the right of it, over that way, is about 7 computers that the Jaws of Poetry is on. What the Jaws of Poetry is a tutorial on the terminology of poetry. Every job has its own language, its own jargon. So does literature, and poetry in particular. And the reason that you need to do the Jaws of Poetry before we get to the metaphysical poets is so that when I talk about implied metaphor or alliteration or connotation, you remember what those things are. You've probably had most of them before anyway, but this will be a refresher for a great many of you. So the Jaws of Poetry will teach you those terms, and it will also test you on those terms. So what you need to do is to go over to the library. Again, it's only on 7 machines, and the Jaws are going to be due about the 3rd week in the course, which I think is February this is Tuesday, right? 6th. February, you should have this done by February 6th. You want to get over there now so that those machines aren't taken up by people who don't need to do the Jaws of Poetry. The reason it's only on 7 machines is this thing was done quite a while ago, at a time when they didn't know how to encrypt computer programs so that you couldn't crack into them. And so they had a little physical device that was put onto the computer so that if you were going to use this program that they had written, you needed this little device. Well, we only bought 7 devices 10 years ago, whenever it was we did this. And so that means it's only on 10 machines. When you go to the Jaws of Poetry, you type in, you log into it. What will happen is you'll have the screen, there'll be an icon for the Jaws of Poetry, click on that, then the Jaws of Poetry screen will come up. You type in the last 4 digits. Now that says of your Social Security number, but it's, instead we'll probably use your student number. In fact, when the grades are posted, and as you go out, you'll see a bulletin board there with the grades from last semester on. They'll be posted by the last 4 digits of your student number. Your student number is on, I think it should be on your schedule, and it might be on your ID card. And if you don't know what it is, once I get my roster set up on the computer, I'll be able to. By the time I'm posting grades, if you don't know it, come up, I'll show it to you. In any case, well, you may want to go before you, if you have your student number, use that. If you don't, use the last 4 digits of your Social Security number and your initials. And then the computer will record The computer will record your grades on each of these things, on each of these tests. But there's a sheet I have to go and make more of, and it's only a second from now that I'm going to do this, so I'll probably remember it, where you'll write down what you got on each test. And then you'll give me that sheet back in case the computer doesn't record them. We'll be looking at the computer eventually to check them up, so you can't say, oh, I got 100 in them. Eventually I'll know that you actually didn't if you didn't. So write down what you really got, and then you'll give that sheet back to me. Also make a copy of it because I lose stuff. It's 2:45 now. For some reason, this didn't go off. If it ever gets much past 2:45, just start waving and pointing to the door. We'll be out of here by about 4:05. If it gets much after that, just get up and leave. It means my alarm went off and I didn't realize the class was over. Sometimes I'll recognize, because from about 5 to 4 on, the whole place starts to look like the Titanic, because we're all listening towards starboard because everybody's leaning towards the door. But if I don't pick that up, just get up and go. So we'll take a break, come back at 3 o'clock. I'll get the other sheet of this, Jaws of Poetry. So when you go over to do the Jaws of Poetry, first thing that you do is you sign in on it. Then you get a screen that gives you those 3 options: test out, introduction, and unit screen. I'd suggest that you look at the introduction before you make a decision on what you're going to do, because you have 2 choices after that. Let me set this for a second. One is, you take a look at the introduction. You're really good at poetry anyway. You can go back to the original menu, and you choose Test Out. And in Test Out, there's I think it's a 100-question test on the terms. Now that one will, if you do that, the overall test, it will tell you whether you're right or wrong after each question, but it won't tell you why. If, on the other hand, you take the unit-by-unit approach, come back out to that main menu, and then you go to unit screen. If you go to unit screen, it will list, I think there are 5 units, 5 subunits. As you can see, diction and syntax, alliteration and assonance, real rhyme, false rhyme, metaphor, simile, and implied metaphor, allusion, personification. If you're going to go unit by unit, let's say you start out with diction and syntax. You go to that unit, and it will explain to you what diction is, it will explain to you what syntax is, it will give you some examples of both of them, it will contrast the 2 of them, and it will give you a couple sample questions. When you finish that part of the unit, you go back to the main menu and you select Test Out, and you go to Unit Test. And there's a test on diction and syntax. Now the advantage to that one is that as you answer the questions, it not only tells you whether you're right or wrong, it tells you why you were wrong if you were wrong, which means that you have a much better chance of passing that one, because some of the questions will be similar. In other words, you get denotation wrong the first time, it shows you why you were wrong. Second time there's a denotation question, you probably should get it right. That's the grade that you write down on this unit-by-unit part. So when you finish diction and syntax, go to Test Out, you take the diction and syntax test, and then you write the grade down here, and I write it down somewhere else in case I lose this when you give it to me. If you decided to test out overall, then you take this overall part. Just take that test and put that 1 grade in there and give it to me. When you finish the diction and syntax test, you go back to the menu, go to units, pick a different unit. Go through the unit, it tells you all about alliteration and assonance, and then you take the test on alliteration and assonance. You don't have to do all of these one after another. You can take them when you got half an hour or so between class. Depending on how much poetry you know and how fast you click through the screens, this will take you anywhere from an hour to 3 hours to do all 5 units. When you get that done, you want to turn it into me, and everybody's going to have it done by February the 6th. The grade that you get on that will be worth up to, in other words, the average. Say you got a bunch, you add 80s and 90s on that, so it came to 85, which was 86. That came to 86, so that rounds up to a 9. So that means when you go to take the midterm, you've already got 9 points in hand. If you don't finish the Jaws of Poetry by the 6th, though, you got no points going into the midterm. So the midterm's worth, anybody have any questions on Jaws? Okay, so that, points you get on the Jaws of Poetry, the average of those tests will go towards the midterm, and the midterm as a whole is worth 100 points. So if you need to get 90, as you do, to get an A on the midterm, you've already got 9 points, or maybe 10 points already going in from the Jaws of Poetry. So you really only have to get an 80 for an A. On that midterm, you will have the questions the week before. And there'll be a 6 or 7 or maybe even more short essays and probably about 8 or 9 long essays to choose from. And how you'll choose, basically the week before when I give out those questions, I'll tell you what the best strategy is for taking the test and point out some things on the questions that you might that might be helpful in answering. You can't bring anything into the test, so you've got to memorize your outline, and you again, you shouldn't try to write the whole paper beforehand and memorize it, because that won't work. Unless you're a theater major and you're used to memorizing 40 pages of text, you probably have difficulty if you write it beforehand. But what you do want to do is, as you'll see when we look at the 100 points, how to score 100 points, is you want to make an outline for yourself, put the examples into that, put the quotations that you're going to use into it, and memorize those. People are often intimidated by the idea of memorizing quotations. It's not hard. I mean, almost every one of you can tell me word for word at least 20 television commercials. You can probably quote at length from half of the movies that you've seen. If you, one of the easiest ways to memorize the quotations is to just record them onto a tape. Play it on your way back and forth to Brookdale. They'll become second nature to you, just like hearing a commercial 10 times, you know all the words to it. So don't be intimidated by the fact that you need to use quotations on this. Again, that's the best evidence for your interpretation. There's also an in-class final exam. We'll be taking these, by the way, over in the library on computers. If you don't type very well on the computer and it's going to take you longer to that, or you want to do it longhand, you can do it longhand if you want to. I think it works out a lot better on the computer because you get to revise it a lot easier. And it's a lot easier to read when it's printed out. When you get a handwritten exam, if the writing is not all that clear, and the person reading it has to keep stopping to figure out words, their impression, which is generally what the grade gets based on, their impression of your essay is that it was disjointed, that it stopped and started. So you can minimize that by printing it out. The grades on the quizzes, the average of your quiz grades will go towards the final exam grade. So in other words, again, you may have 10 points going into that if you got all 10s on the, or mostly 10s on the quizzes. Anybody have any question on what you need to do in terms of evaluation in the midterm and the final? Okay, attendance. College is a full-time job. So many of you have 2 full-time jobs now. You don't do one, you get fired from it. You don't show up, they don't pay you. Same thing here. If you miss too many classes, I'm required to drop you from the course. That means you get an F if it's past the time when you can voluntarily drop. Don't just vanish. things start getting too much for you, come and see me, see what we can work out on it. If you just vanish and you don't go and officially drop the course, Brookdale will turn it into an F. It doesn't matter what I put on it. I can't give an incomplete. They don't even have that grade anymore without filling out a form of some sort. And I can't put down withdrawal assumed like I used to. They turn it into an F. What that means is that if it either stays an F or you take the course over again, and to bring it up to a C, you got to get an A next time. So don't just bail out on the course. You have, I think it's about a month that you can still drop a course. And I don't want to see you drop this course. I would like to see all of you do extremely well. I won't lessen the standards of the course so that you can. The standards haven't been enormously high in the past, but they're a little bit higher this semester. In any case, you need to show up, you need to do the work. The good news is you don't need an excuse for missing class. You don't need to tell me why. Mostly people's reasons for missing class are sad stories anyway, and it's depressing enough to be old, so I'm not sure you really want to know why you weren't here. However, each missed class will subtract 10 points from your final grade, not your final exam, from your final grade. However, you can get some or all of those points back in the form of a 2-page paper on the material presented in class during the absence and the assigned reading. One of the reasons why I'm videotaping this, and I'm going to be doing this throughout the semester, and is that the make-up essays, which are on the back of, for some of you, a white sheet and for some of you, a pink sheet, are pretty specific to the lecture. And one of the reasons I made them that way is because people were going online and getting, almost like going to the encyclopedia and getting very general and sometimes inaccurate information. So now they're much more specific to the lectures, but if I'm going to hold you to what was done when you weren't here, there has to be some way for you to access that, and that way is going to be the videotapes. Again, they're not going to be very good TV, but at least it'll give you the general information, and it'll make it easier for you to be able to get the 10 points back. In the past, the makeup papers were either accepted them or I didn't. And towards the end of the year, I was accepting things that I was kind of ashamed to have accepted. So I'm trying to alleviate all that guilt on my part now by setting some standard, and I'm going to be pretty consistent about it. So you need to do the makeup, the 2-page makeup paper. Those are the topics. When you miss class, email me and I'll tell you which topic it is that you need to write the paper on. Now it says that's, you got 2 weeks from the class that you miss. I may not hold you to that 2 weeks because it may take a full week or more to get this tape into the library. So in other words, if you miss today, the tape on today may not be there until after next Tuesday. So it may be 3 weeks instead of 2 weeks. But we'll see how this process goes of doing the video and putting it in there. But generally, you'll probably have to go and take a look at the video for what you missed before you write the paper if you're going to get the 10 points back on it. Anybody have any question on the attendance policy? Okay. Anybody have any questions on the objectives? Reading for next time, remember, is Allegory of the Cave and those quotes, and you probably ought to read the sample test before you start that. Let's take a look at test-taking techniques. I used to do the split brain in here, but I don't anymore because it took up too much time. But I would get to test-taking about the 5th week, and the first thing that it says on it is test-taking begins on day 1. So it didn't do an awful lot of good to give people advice that I should have given them 5 weeks earlier. If you're going to succeed in a course, organization is probably more important than anything else. What you ought to do is how many of you take notes? That's good. How many of you do anything with those notes at the end of class? This makes a difference. What you ought to do is just take a minute or two when you're at the end of a class, whether it's this class or any class, look over your notes and write a 1-paragraph summary of the lecture. I said several purposes. The same thing is true when you do a reading. Now, when you do your readings for a course, how many of you just take the book, sit there for 2 hours or 3 hours, however long it takes, and don't get up at all? That's good. You ought to take a break about every 20, 25 minutes or so. The reason for that is, brain tends to remember the first and last things in a series. The more times you take a break, within a certain limit, obviously you take a break every 10 minutes, everything's going to be disjointed. If you take a break about every 25, you've got more, and you do that 3 times, you've got 3 sets of first and last. 3 things that your brain is going to naturally remember more easily than otherwise. When you do a reading and when you take a break, first thing you ought to do is write down a couple sentences summary of what you've read and 3 questions on what you've just read. Then you go and take a break. When you come back, answer the questions. Then start the second part of the reading. 20, 25 minutes again. Stop, write a little summary, ask yourself 3 questions, take a break, come back, answer the 3 questions, go on with the next. Now what this does is you take those summaries just like you take the summaries of your notes. And 2 ways to make them useful. One is, when you get to class, assuming you get a parking space, and you got about 5 minutes or so before class, you go over a summary from the previous lecture. Why should you do that? It doesn't matter what happened last week. Most classes, the instructor will start with a summary of the previous week. He'll probably ask you questions on the previous week. Everybody else in the class probably has trouble remembering yesterday, let alone last week. But if you've gone in 5 minutes before class, you read the summary of last week, you're way ahead. Sometimes, have you ever had the kind of instructor that just lives to find people who haven't done the assignment? No? You're the only one who's had one? Nobody else ever had one like that? Wow, you've been enormously fortunate. Normally, when they find somebody who hasn't done the assignment, they keep picking on them all until they find another victim. And they tend to humiliate them. One of the things about teaching is every profession attracts certain kinds of mental illness. And in teaching, it's often people who don't have a real good ego. And so some people make themselves feel better by making other people feel worse. And if you get one of those psychotics, one of the easiest ways to avoid being their victim is to know the answer right off the bat. So in other words, when they're looking around and doing that review on last week, you answer the first couple of those questions, they'll leave you alone for the rest of the class. Also, you're setting up, even if you don't have the psychotic kind of instructor, do you ever have the ones that wander around the classroom and lean into your space, that tower over you? What are they doing when they do that? What are they trying to do? They're trying to intimidate you. Why? Because they don't feel particularly secure in themselves. And so they're frightened, so they want to intimidate you. If you get one of those, and they don't necessarily abound. It's not that the majority of teachers are like that, but you know, the majority of policemen are perfectly sane, hard-working people. They don't go in it just for the opportunity to beat people up. But there's a certain percentage that do. And they don't do any better job at weeding them out than any other profession does. So if you get those kind of instructors, you got to recognize who they are and One way to avoid them is you read your summary, you know the questions right at the beginning. The other advantage to that is that quite often your grade doesn't really get determined on the exam. What you get on the exam really gets determined in all the classes leading up to that. The instructor forms an opinion, generally based on your participation in class, of how well you're doing in the class. And they go into the test with an image in mind of how well you're going to do in the essay. One of the things about reality is, first of all, it's irrelevant. Reality doesn't mean anything. What's important is what people think is real. In other words, if you believed this building was on fire, you would get out of here just as quick as if it really was on fire. People act in terms of what they believe to be reality. Well, if you create in your instructor's mind the idea that you're pretty bright, you know this stuff pretty well, then when they read your essay, they're already predisposed to seeing a good essay. What happens if you write a terrible one? You're less likely to get as low a grade as you would have gotten if that were part of their expectation. In other words, you got somebody in class, they're sharp, they always have something interesting to say, something relevant, you think they know the stuff pretty good, they write a bad test. Generally, you say to yourself, well, there must be something wrong here. They must be having a bad day for some reason. So maybe you get a second chance to take the test, or the instructor would probably not give it an F where they would give somebody else's. So a lot of your grade is determined by the impression you make. And one of the ways to do that is by being prepared. If you've done the readings, it's easier to follow the lecture. And it's easier to answer questions on the lecture if you've done those little summaries and read them right before you went to class. That puts you way ahead of everybody else in the class. Often, a good question is as significant as a good answer. Often, if you can anticipate where the next step of the lecture is going, and you ask a question on that, instructor sees you know where this is going. You're a step ahead. So that's always a good idea. Now, don't just ask questions to ask questions. What is the one time you absolutely ought to ask questions? As soon as you start to feel lost, as soon as you're not following what's going on. Why don't you want to wait 10 or 15 minutes?
You're probably going to be on something else.
I'm sorry.
I think you're probably going to be on something else.
The class will move on to something else. The instructor will have to go all the way back and try to figure out where it was you got lost. Whereas if you get lost, if you ask when you get lost, yeah, okay, guys have trouble asking directions. But when you get lost, it's asking directions. When you first get lost, it's easier to get directions back to where you were going than it is if you've ridden around for an hour. The more lost you get, the harder it is to figure out where you got lost. So it's a good idea to ask questions as soon as things stop making sense to you. Because often it's only a minor point which you're confused on. And what people tend to do is, if they miss a minor point, to dwell on that. And you're thinking about, what did that mean? So what happens to what's going on while you're doing that thinking? It gets lost. You miss all that. So you want to use another way, by the way, to use those summaries, beside reading them right before class, the summaries of your reading, the summaries of your lectures. And that is to read them right before you go to sleep. One of the theories about dreaming is that it's a process of taking verbal information and moving it over. Do you remember I said there were two sides of the brain? One side thinks in words, the other side thinks in icons. That dreaming may be the process of taking those word information, and putting it into pictures. Pictures store an enormous amount of information. That idea that a picture is worth 1,000 words, it's probably worth 10,000, maybe even 1,000,000 words. There are things that if you could see them, they contain more information than if you have them described for you. For example, if you had to get somebody to that particular part of the rug in this room at Brookdale, writing them out information to make sure they got there, because if they don't get there, I'm going to shoot you. You might spend 20 pages writing them specific directions, whereas you could give them a map and a photograph of the room and another photograph of that part of the rug and get them here with 2 sheets of paper instead of 50 sheets of paper. You can store that much more information graphically. Well, one of the things that dreaming may be is the brain putting information over on that side, so that when you read things before you go to sleep, the brain has them handy and it puts them over immediately. And so they're stored a little bit more firmly than they might be otherwise. So you want to make these summaries, and you probably want to read them before you go to sleep, definitely before class. And the whole process of summarizing will help the ideas congeal for you. The more actively you participate in your learning, a lot of us learn intuitively. We don't really think about what it is we're doing. We don't have an intention. We kind of just let it happen. Well, if you direct the way it's happening, the odds are that you'll learn more and certainly that you'll retain more. When you get the information for a test, you ought to arrange it in a particular way. For example, if you were going to have an objective test, what would you make important in your arrangement? The details or the general ideas? We're going to have a 30-question objective test. What does it have to concentrate on? How many, you got 10 pages to read. How many general ideas are there probably in 10 pages? 100? 10? No, probably very relatively, general ideas, probably relatively few, 4 or 5. 30-question test, so it can't be focusing on the general ideas, but there's hundreds of details in there. So in other words, an objective test is probably going to be looking for details. So when you do your organizing, you'll look for details. You're going to write if it's an essay test, what are you going to look for? Details or general ideas? General ideas. Because an essay, it's hard to write an essay on one particular detail. 750 words on one detail would be hard to do. So you want to know what it is you're studying for. Well, how do you find out which of those it's going to be? How do you know whether your midterm is going to be objective or an essay? Usually the instructor will at least tell you that much. The ones who won't tell you specifically what it's going to be on, there's going to be a question on romanticism. Will at least tell you whether it's going to be an essay or whether it's going to be objective. So you at least know what kind of test to study for. Often they'll give you some pretty good ideas on the general substance of the test. If you think you're having trouble studying for the test, you should go to almost every instructor at every college has office hours. If you feel like you don't know what to do at all about this test, go and see them. And the odds are that they'll, in the process of explaining it to you, they'll probably give away what some of the questions are. When you take a test, you have to have the same attitude towards it that an athlete has. The difference between a good athlete and a great athlete has to do with what they do when they lose. Any good athlete doesn't like to lose. Anybody here that are an athlete? Let me put it another way. You play a sport. Yeah. What do you do when you lose? And maybe start bitching, complaining, and complain about the refereeing.
I was always in cross country and got last, so never complained.
Actually, anytime you go out there and do something, it puts you a step ahead of the people who didn't go out. When we get to romanticism, you'll see that it's not the outcome that matters, it's the struggle. In other words, it's often more difficult to be the person who comes in last than it is the person who comes in first, depending on your natural talent and ability. That's one of the things you got to recognize on tests. Some people have a natural knack for taking tests. They like to do it and they do it well. If you don't have that natural talent, then what you've got to do is to look at the first question that a great athlete asks himself is, why did I lose? Was it something, where was my game weak? Once you identify where you're weak, then what do? You work on those weaknesses. So you fail the test. You look at somebody, get somebody else's paper who got an A. Look and see, what's the difference between theirs and mine? Did they use more terminology from the course? Was their answer better organized than mine? Did they give more examples than I did? Now you know what it is that you did wrong and you can improve on it. The next time, you have to take the test as, again, just the way you take a loss. You learn an awful lot from a loss in athletics because it tells you where your weaknesses are. Sometimes they're the hardest thing to identify. Once you identify them, then you can start to work on them. You're entitled to sulk for a little while when you don't do well in anything, but not for very long. That's what separates people who succeed eventually from people who don't succeed at all. If you never get out of that sulking stage, you don't get any better. You've got to be able to step back from it and say, why did it turn out this way? What part of that was my fault, and what are the weaknesses that led to that? And then you identify those and you work on them. You know to find more examples next time. You know to use more terms next time. You know to organize your essay better next time. You should look at a bad test as an opportunity to do extremely well on the next one. You can't let the test define you. You can't let the test defeat you. All it's done is give you information, necessary information on how to improve what you're going to do. It's a good idea to study with somebody else. Why? How many of you do study with other people? Nobody. Oh, good. One. Why do you do that?
And talk it out and figure it out easier.
You can figure it out easier. A lot of times another student can explain something better than a teacher can. And also, you may be the one doing the explaining. What's the advantage to that? You come to understand it better in the process of explaining it to somebody else. You never really know a thing until you've taught it. And in the process of teaching it, of course, you learn new stuff too. Sometimes in the process of trying to explain something to somebody else, you'll have insights you wouldn't otherwise have had. So studying together benefits a number of people. Also, when you have courses unlike this one, where you have like biology or any of the sciences, often the amount of work is pretty huge. What you can do in a study group is to break the work up. Now that doesn't mean that you don't read chapter. You got chapter 1 through 3 and somebody else has 4 through 6 and somebody else has 7 through 9. That doesn't mean you don't read those chapters. You read them, but you don't have to focus on them as much as you do on the initial ones. Because when you get together in the study group, you explain answer any questions anybody has in the first 3. The person who's got the next segment explains theirs. So you get a lot more in-depth information than you would have by yourself, and it helps spread out the amount of work necessary to do that. So study groups are always a good idea. There are a couple difficulties with them. One, you don't want to make them too big. Why not? Too much trouble organizing. You got 10 chapters, you give everybody a chapter. Anytime you got a group of 10 people, what's the odds of them all showing up at a given time? Not real good. 1 or 2 of them are always going to be missing, so you're going to have holes in it. You want to find people that are dedicated, and if you're serious about having a study group, you got to make it clear that everybody in it's got to be committed. And if the person doesn't show up, you got to say you're out of this. Because we depended on you for chapters 6 through 7, and you weren't here. You got to pull your weight. So in other words, you got to be ruthless. Some of this process of education is like anything else. You have to be committed to it, and you have to get the other people around you committed to it. Now, often another advantage of studying with people is that they'll help motivate you. You may be kind of lazy on your own, But when other people are depending on you to do that, most people rise to the occasion. They do better. So that's another advantage to having groups. Get a good night's sleep before the test. How many of you have pulled all-nighters? Stayed up all night studying and went straight to the test? Nobody. Nobody's out. A couple. So was that successful?
No.
Generally, it isn't if you don't get at least 2 hours sleep. Because in the 2 hours, what you've been studying gets shifted over to that icon side of the brain, that image side, that picture side of the brain. And so it's easier to recall. The other difficulty is that when you stay up all night, you feel fine going into the test. But about half an hour in, you hear this loud thump. And about 45 minutes in, you realize that was your head hitting the desk. And that it's been laying there for 15 minutes and you haven't answered any of the questions because you've fallen off to sleep. It's hard to think when you're tired. It's no coincidence that most of the major industrial catastrophes occurred in the wee hours of the morning. 3 Mile Island occurred around between 1 and 3 a.m. Bhopal, where the gas cloud killed like 2,000 people, that occurred in the middle of the night because people don't think well when they're tired. And the same thing's true when you're taking a test. Stay up too long, you're not going to be able to stay awake. And if you are, you're not going to be able to think very well. Generally, the more tired you are, the more difficulty you have thinking. It's much better to get a good night's sleep and do less studying than it is to pull an all-nighter. Now, if you've been doing those summaries of the readings and the summaries of the lectures, studying for a test is going to take you so little time that it'll be kind of scary in itself. Because one of the things that'll happen is when you read those summaries, it'll bring back everything that you knew previously. And so all you're going to have to do is read your summaries before you go into the test, especially if it's an essay test. So getting a good night's sleep is a good idea. Test anxiety. As it happens, that picture side of the brain is most intimately connected with your emotional state. Any advantage to it is it's a lot like Freud's idea of the unconscious, or the id. You've heard of Freud, right? 3 parts of personality. Superego has all the rules. The id has all the desires. The ego moderates between the two. It makes compromises between the superego's rules and the id's desires, often by giving the id a fantasy of what it wants. Because the id doesn't know fantasy from reality. Well, turns out that the id is really the right side of your brain. And the good thing about it not knowing fantasy from reality is that you can give it some fantasies that will take away a lot of your test anxiety. Some of the anxiety in test anxiety comes from sometime in 2nd grade when everybody got a gold star except you. And that painful experience is still current as far as this side of your brain is concerned. And every time somebody brings up a test or you think about a test, it thinks about that terrible experience and it churns up your emotions. Emotions go up. What happens to the intellect? It goes down. Now, when you go to sleep, you need to say to yourself in the 3rd person, because the unconscious is a separate entity. You really have 2 separate personalities that correspond to the 2 sides of your brain. Most of us only pay attention to the word using one, but the image using one has just as much effect on everything that you think, especially on your emotional state. So you say to it, you're going to have a vivid dream, and in this dream, you're going to take a test. And in the dream, when you take the test, you'll write easily, you'll have a big smile, and picture yourself as having a big smile on your face, writing easily and fluidly, taking the test up, handing it to the instructor, and they put a big A on it. Now, the 3 Mile Island, 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 the 3 Mile Is unconscious, or the right brain, doesn't know fantasy from reality. So if you do this every night, by the time you get to the midterm, say what, 8 weeks in, as far as your unconscious is concerned, you've had 48 straight A's. So it's feeling pretty good about tests now, and not pretty bad. Now your conscious side may say, well, that was all dreams and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what your conscious side said. It doesn't have that control over your emotions. What's controlling your emotions is that unconscious side. So by giving yourself those images, and then, so let's say you do that, and then you go and take the midterm, and you get a C on it instead of an A. The rational side of you says, well, we got a C, but we haven't gotten that many C's. That was good. We're really on our way. By the time you get to the final, if you've done this every night, you've now got something like 100 A's and 1 C. So the part of you that makes you afraid believes that you're going to do well. That reduces your anxiety, and when you go into to take the test, you've reduced a lot of your test anxiety. So you're not there, and you'll do better in the test. And the more often you do better in the real world tests, the more you don't have to do the fantasy tests anymore. In other words, you can convince yourself that you're going to do well, and that's a large part of it. Remember, people get the reality they expect. If you expect to do well, you probably will. If you expect to do badly, you probably will. So what you're doing is creating that expectation in yourself. Another way to reduce test anxiety is go to the place where the test is going to be taken. If I told you that we were going to torture each of you later in the semester, and I took you to the dungeon, when you went to the dungeon, you'd already be afraid. But if you hang out in the dungeon all the time, it loses its power over you. So in other words, if you're going to be taking most of your tests in the testing center, do 2 things. 1, go and sit in there. That alone will help. But if you go and sit in there and take something pleasant to do, I don't know if they'll let you take earphones in or not. If you go and sit there and listen to music that you like, or you go and sit there and read a book of cartoons. So you start laughing too much, they'll throw you out. But something that pleases you, and you do that several times. When you go to the testing center to take the test, you're not going to be in that panic state that you would be otherwise. You've made the place familiar. If it's in a room like this, one of the things to do is to get there early. One of the reasons you want to get there early is because, again, most of our fears are unconscious. So you want to deal with the unconscious part. When you're the first one there, the room is yours. See, we're mammals. We have a lot of things that we do that are mammalian. They don't involve the intellect at all. Mammals are territorial generally. If you look at an audience filling up a theater, first person goes in and sits where they want. Second person who comes into the theater, total stranger, will they go down and sit next to that person? No, almost never. They'll go to where they generally want to sit, as close to where they can sit without getting next to that person. And the third person who comes into the room, where will they go? Up next to one of the other 2 that are there? No, they'll go someplace else, and the theater will fill up generally. I mean, people want certain seats, so those seats will fill up, but generally, people will take seats without getting right next to somebody if they possibly can. That's because it's their territory. There's a part of us that's worried about going into somebody else's territory, because when mammals all have teeth, and so if you go into their territory, they'll bite you. So if you sit down to somebody next to you, your unconscious thinks they're going to bite you. What you want to do is to make it your territory. By going there first, the room becomes yours. It used to surprise me that sometimes people would show up late for class and they wouldn't come in. They would stand around outside until the break. Why? Or does that seem psychotic to you too? They wouldn't come in because they didn't want to pass all these people to get to the one empty seat that was left. For a mammal, you got to invade the space of 12 other mammals. The odds go way up on getting bit there. So it's a scary thing to your unconscious. So they didn't want to come in. In fact, to show how territorial you are, well, it won't work for this class. This is the first time we've had it. But when you go to a class, do you sit in a different seat every time? No, I'll bet that for the next 15 weeks, the odds are you're going to be sitting in exactly the seat that you picked out today, even if you don't think it's such a great seat, because you've already established your territory there. We don't mark our territory like dogs, but we're just as territorial. So when you go to the room, it becomes your territory. When people come in, they're now entering your space. They have to be worried. You don't have to be worried because it's yours. Even when the instructor comes, it's not his space anymore. It's your space. Now when you get that quiets again, that unconscious part of you. Granted, this doesn't sound real rational, but how rational is it to be afraid of a test? Most fear comes out of that, it is irrational in itself. It comes out of that part of your brain, that unconscious part, that right side of the brain. So you have to deal with it, not in terms of, I'll make it make sense, but in terms of, you got to deal with it like you would deal with a crazy person. You got to find some way to manipulate it. And that's one way to do it. Get there first, that'll help relax it. Second way is you don't waste the time when you're there. You do what's called the long relax. One of the reasons why test anxiety inhibits people's ability to think is its effect on your heart rate, your circulation, and your breathing. When you get afraid, you tend to breathe more shallowly than you would otherwise. You breathe short, quick breaths. When people get really frightened, they pant. Little short breaths. The brain lives on sugar and oxygen. If you deplete those things, it doesn't work very well. Well, when you're shallow breathing, the exchange between oxygen and carbon dioxide goes down. Carbon dioxide builds up in your blood. What does that do to your thinking? It decreases it. You want to get as much oxygen in there as you can. So one of the things you do in the slow relax is you take long, slow, deep breaths. The other thing is the sugar getting to the brain. Well, the oxygen and the sugar are both influenced by your circulation. Your circulation tends to go down because when you get afraid, what happens to your muscles? Do they tense up or do they relax and become kind of flaccid? They tense up. When they tense up, they squeeze on that circulation. The more tense you get, especially here in your neck, the more you're going to be cutting off some of that blood supply to the brain. It isn't going to get its sugar, it's not going to get its oxygen, it's not going to work as well. So to do the long relax, you start out with the muscles of your feet. You take a long, slow, deep breath in. As you're doing that, you contract your feet, you pull your toes in. Hold your breath for a moment or two. Then as you breathe out, you relax those muscles. Then you take a long, deep breath as you flex the muscles of your calves. Hold it for a minute. Breathe out long and slowly, and relax the muscles of your calf. You work your way up to all the muscles in your body. Pay special attention to your lower back, your neck, and your forehead. Those are the places where tension seems to build up. So you want to flex the muscles of your forehead and then relax. Same thing with your neck. You want to tense it up, and then you want to relax it. And rolling it around helps to relax it as well. By doing this long relax, working your way through all of the muscles of your body, you do two things. One, you increase circulation. You do more than two things. You increase your circulation and you increase the amount of oxygen. Long, slow, deep breaths, better respiratory exchange, more oxygen in the blood, more oxygen to the brain. The brain works better. By relaxing the muscles, you increase the circulation. More oxygen to the brain, more sugar to the brain. That makes it work better. The second thing is that your mind and your body work together and they influence one another. What's going on in your body affects your attitude. For example, let your shoulders droop, let your head hang down a little bit and scowl. Pay attention to how you feel. Now sit up straight, put your head up and smile. You notice the difference in your energy level? The way your body is affects your mental state. When you're afraid, you breathe fast. You've been breathing slow. That unconscious part of you came in here going, oh, this is a scary thing. But the body isn't acting as if it's scary. It's acting as if everything's fine. Slow, deep breathing. The muscles are all relaxed. This right side of the brain, this unconscious part of your mind says, well, maybe I'm panicking here for no reason. The body's not afraid. I guess it's okay. And it'll reduce the emotional state that you have, the anxiety that you have in your emotional state. So you do the long relax. After you've done that, you might want to take out your summaries, scan them one more time, because that'll reassure the rational side of your brain. See, the problem with these techniques is that they're not rational and step by step. And so the conscious part of your mind usually rejects them. And that keeps them from working. So you want to give your rational side of your brain good reason to think you're going to do well as well. And by reading over those summaries, they'll be all happy by that time. Halfway through them, you'll be saying to yourself, I know this stuff. I don't even need to read the rest of these. So rationally, you're prepared. You think you're going to do well. You've changed your emotional state. You've changed your physiological state. So you're going to do better on the test. And the more often you do this, the more you make this habitual, the more your test anxiety goes down. Just the way it spiraled up in the first place. From one failure, it went to another, and that made you more anxious on the next one. You couldn't think as well, and so you did worse, and you get this terrible spiral. Well, you can make it spiral down just the way it spiraled up by using these techniques. Anybody have any questions on the test anxiety parts? To involve your rational mind, you might have an organized approach to things. For example, if you're taking an objective test, go through it, answer all the questions, even the ones you're not sure of. Take what seems to be the answer. When you're all finished, go back. You can put a little check by the ones that you weren't sure of. Go back and look at them. Unless you have a specific reason, don't change them. Your intuitive answer is much more likely to be right than if you second guess yourself. In other words, your first guess is right more often than your second guess is. Unless you have a good reason for it. Then you would go back and change the answer. You can also organize the way you're going to take the test. If you're going to take an essay test, the questions are there's a couple worth 10 points, there's one worth 30 points, there's one worth 50 points. Which one do you want to start with? The 50-point question. Why?
Because you have a better chance of getting more points.
You can get more points from it. It's amazing how often a person will write this extremely lengthy essay on a 10-point question. Well, no matter how good it is, they're not going to give you more than 10 points. Or if they do, they might give you 15. So in other words, a lousy 50-point essay is going to get you more points than a fantastic 10-point one. You want to pace yourself in terms of what the questions are worth. So you got an hour to take the test. The 50-point question gets half an hour. Write down when you should be stopping that question. The test starts at 1 o'clock. At 1:30, you're going to be finished the 50-point question. At 1:30, you're going to stop the 50-point question, whether you finished it or not. Now, if you followed the directions in how to score 100 points on a 100-point essay, you should be able to stop at any time during the essay and not lose all that much. Because you're going to answer it superficially in the first paragraph, and then you're going to develop that all the way through. So in other words, you could keep on writing, or you can stop. It won't make a huge amount of difference. At 1:30, you're going to stop, and then what are you going off to? The 10s or the 30? The 30. and that should get about 15 minutes. So you write down when you're going to stop, or set your little alarm on your watch. Yes, it may annoy other people when it goes off. So it depends on whether you want to be liked or whether you want to do well on the test. And if you don't want to disturb other people, you just keep glancing. You watch every once in a while. When it gets to 3:45, you stop that question and go on to the 10-point questions for the rest of the time. So in other words, you organize your time so that it's used most effectively. This organization makes the rational side of you confident about what it is that you're going to do. Generally, if it's a standardized test, you have no clue whatsoever, B is the most likely answer. Here's another technique, and it comes from the fact that this side of your brain that thinks in pictures, in multi-sensory icons, records just about everything that ever happened to you. It's all here on the right side of your brain. Storage capacity is almost limitless. You've got 3 trillion brain cells. They can connect with more than one other brain cell. So the number of interconnections within your brain, each of which probably indicates a bit of information, is almost limitless. You've got a huge storage capacity over there. So that means is that mostly everything that happened to you is there. When you sat through the lecture that this question is on, it's stored over in this side of the brain. The hard part about that storage is it's usually hard to access because you can't do it very well with words. So what you want to do, you have no clue what the answer to this question is. Close your eyes. Imagine your instructor giving the lecture on that subject, and picture yourself asking the instructor the question that's on the test. Take the answer that jumps into your head. Almost all the time it will be right. It will be right because you're accessing the memory of that instance from when it happened. And so it'll play it back for you. And that's why you do it in picture form, why you visualize the instructor and visualize yourself asking him that question. Beside, what do you got to lose? You got no clue what the answer is anyway. Maybe it's magic and mumbo jumbo, but you got nothing to lose, so you might as well do it. And what will happen is you'll find that you're far more often than not, you will get the right answer that way. Main thing you got to remember about a test is it's not a measure of your worth as a person. A long time ago, you could tell when it was exam time at Rutgers. All you had to do was watch for the emergency vehicles, for the ambulances, because people always jumped off the 6th floor balcony. Some of them jumped off not because they failed the test, they jumped off because they got a B for the first time in their life. And they said, oh my God, I'm a B person. My parents want an A person. And they would take a header off the 6th floor. That's less pronounced now than it was then. You still have enormous stresses on you, certainly. But you have to keep in mind that a test is not a measure of who you are. Your grades don't say who you are. There have been plenty of people who didn't even complete college. There have been people who failed out and went on to become enormous successes in life. So you can't, excuse me.
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates, yeah. And he's not the only one. I mean, if you go to Wall Street, not everybody there's been to college. You see, it's not absolutely necessary for a monetarily successful life, and it's certainly the grade that you get on a test has got nothing to do with how successful your relationships are going to be for the rest of your life, and they're really the most important thing that you're going to achieve. You have to recognize this is not a definition of you as a person. All it is a measure of how well you were able to respond to a certain series of questions on a given day under the circumstances that were then in effect. In other words, your emotional state. You might take that test another day and do a lot better in it or a lot worse in it. And the most important thing about taking a test is that you got to look at it and use the information in order to do better the next time. Anybody have any questions on test taking techniques? Okay, next time we're going to look at We're going to go pretty quickly through how to score 100 points. I'm going to show you the ways of using the picture side of your brain, and we're also going to probably get on to the biographical criticism. So again, we're having a quiz on Plato, Zeno, the quotes that are on that sheet, and the allegory of the cave.